Well, let's go straight into what we already started: Russia and Ukraine, and Donald Trump's policy towards that. It seems that unlike Vladimir Putin, who started in a very favorable position with Donald Trump, Volodymyr Zelensky started in the exact opposite of that and faced quite a hostile approach from the United States and the White House. But it seems that somehow the Ukrainians managed to turn that around. And from where I'm seeing, it seems that now there has been a bit of a shift in the U.S. policy or Donald Trump's view of Ukraine. Would you agree with that, or what is your view?
Well, I think there have been some changes, and I give Zelensky a lot of credit for taking the effort to try and improve the personal relationship with Donald Trump. But this really goes back to the summer of 2019 and Trump's famous phone call with Zelensky about whether the government of Ukraine at the time had interfered in the 2016 U.S. presidential election, which Trump thought was the case, and he wanted Zelensky to investigate, uh, to find Hillary Clinton's computer server, which he thought was hidden somewhere in Ukraine, to find out what the previous Ukrainian government had done to help Biden get reelected. Uh, and he believed this, and he believed that Zelensky hadn't given him satisfaction. Now, he did in 2019 turn the security assistance to Ukraine back on, but his association with that whole affair really was tainted by his first impeachment, which was all about whether he had tried to blackmail Zelensky in that call. So Zelensky didn't have a lot of capital built up in Trump's personal esteem. So when they met then in February of this year in the Oval Office for the first time, I don't think Zelensky appreciated how much Trump saw everything as a very personal matter, and I think he now realizes it was not the wisest thing to do to get into a discussion with Trump in front of TV cameras before they had had a chance to sit down privately to talk about what was necessary. And I think Vice President Vance threw gasoline on the whole thing in the middle of it and just made it worse. So that looked like a pretty grim moment for Ukraine. But as I said, Zelensky worked hard to develop the personal relationship, and I think he has done a very good job of regaining lost ground. At the same time, Putin was showing close to contempt for Trump, up to and including at the Alaska summit, where Trump got nothing out of that. And Putin, I think, concluded that Russia had a free hand in Ukraine thereafter. So Trump has said some nice things about Ukraine, saying they could win the war, they could get their territory back. He would continue to sell weapons and ammunition to European NATO members that could pass it in turn along to Ukraine, and that he'd continue to provide military intelligence, which is very, very important for Ukraine. And that's all good and positive, and I'm glad to hear it. And I hope he decides to send Tomahawk cruise missiles as well. That decision close apparently, but not yet made. Uh, but that's not because Trump has now decided he really wants Ukraine to win the war. He wants out of this situation. Uh, he divides the world into winners and losers. He is a winner. He is always a winner, and he's not winning now in the Ukraine-Russia situation. So the answer is, don't wait around for things to change. Get out of it and go do something else, and hope that will produce an outcome, maybe in the Middle East, that will finally win him the Nobel Peace Prize, which is what he's really after here.
Right, but does that mean that he might now think that the best way to get out of the Ukraine war is by starting to provide more support for Ukraine?
Well, I think by at least maintaining some level of military assistance, and certainly through the intelligence that we're providing, I think that is the net net. But I don't think he's going to do enough to actually change the direction of the war. He has, despite any number of perfectly valid reasons, not sanctioned Russia yet for its sale of oil and gas. Now, that's in part because the U.S. and EU sanctions on Russia in that regard are badly written. If we wanted to stop Russia from earning hard currency by international sales of oil and gas, we just should have prohibited their export and not tried this price cap mechanism because politicians were afraid that consumer prices at the gasoline pump would go up if we took all Russia's oil off the international market. Uh, Trump sanctioned India, but not China, which has bought a lot more Russian oil and gas than India has. So it's if he really wanted to shift the effect of American policy, he would impose new tariffs, new sanctions on Russia, which he has not done, and frankly, I don't think will do.
Well, talking about the sanctions, that's, I would say, one of the examples of something that there's always a lot of discussions about in Europe, which is that Donald Trump makes a big statement about something that he might do, and creates a lot of hope, but then quite often he doesn't really do it. And the sanctions are a typical example of that. How do you think it makes sense to read those instances when he makes this big statement of, there is a deadline, and if something doesn't happen, he might institute new sanctions on Russia? And do you think that the sanctions proposed by Lindsey Graham, that are supposed to be the bone crushing sanctions on Russia, do you think that's ever going to happen?
Well, on the point about what Trump says and then what he actually does, it really goes in both directions. Number one, he promises great results that he doesn't deliver, and he makes big threats that he also doesn't deliver on. The tariffs are a good example of that. I mean, he was at one point proposing really extraordinary tariffs and has backed off to a significant degree, not entirely, but somewhat anyway, which led to the famous joke about on Wall Street about taco, the Mexican food, which also stands for Trump always chickens out. What Trump doesn't understand, and doesn't understand, I think, from his career in New York real estate, is that there are transaction costs when you say one thing and do another. It's not cost free to take positions and then act like you never said anything about it before. I'm not saying you don't sometimes take a maximalist bargaining position. Maybe that's the right thing to do, but it ought to be part of a strategy, and you ought to understand that people, especially your friends and allies, listen to you. And they want to be able to rely on the United States. They want to know where we're going to be, what we're going to do, how we're going to carry out our responsibilities. And if you introduce massive uncertainty into what an American president says, people find that the cost of being an ally begins to get higher and higher. That maybe they're not as safe as they might be. Maybe they can't count on the United States. And they're less willing to do things that they undertake as allies because they think there's a strategic plan that all the allies are following. And I think in Trump's case, the assertion that he's going to do one thing or he will accomplish something that he's not really serious about when he says it undercuts American influence. It doesn't expand it. It draws attention to Donald Trump, that's for sure, which he likes, but it doesn't necessarily lead to a more cohesive or better led alliance.
If you care about geopolitics, and I assume you do since you're listening to this, you might want to consider signing up to get my newsletter, Station Zero. Once every week or two, you'll get a free geopolitical analysis, a story, trend, or pattern of something that's really important but that most people tend to miss. Like the one where I talk about the major threat that Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, is facing, why he's increasingly likely to be defeated in the next year's elections, why his new challenger is not at all who you would expect, and why it might be a lesson for politicians everywhere. If you want to sign up, just click the link in the description.